Hello everyone, welcome. In this video for my early American literature course, I'm going to be covering Ralph Waldo Emerson and his philosophy of Transcendentalism, which arguably is the biggest literary movement in the entire course that we're covering. Of course, the Enlightenment was pretty huge too, and this is almost a response of sorts to the Enlightenment. But to do this, let's go to some notes that I have produced. So the idea of Emerson and Transcendentalism. So before we get to the notes, just a quick word about Emerson. Emerson was, he lived 1803 to 1882, so he lived across most of the century, even past the Civil War. But Emerson is known as one of the great American thinkers. Emerson is more of a philosopher. Well, he's a writer, of course, but he's known for his philosophy, his outlooks on life. That is what, and that is what he is most famous for. And some of his disciples arguably made a great impact on literature. His disciples who took some of his ideas. His disciples might be a strong word, but his followers. So Emerson grew up as he wanted to be a Unitarian minister. Unitarian Christianity is a branch that's more in the northeastern part of the United States, but it's a slightly more liberal form of Christianity. Our text on 178 mentions that Unitarians think that the Bible is God's word, but doesn't believe that we're so depraved by sin as much as earlier forms of Christianity would suggest. But Emerson, despite even being in this sort of looser branch of Christianity, he still started to grow a little more skeptic. He thought, well, the Bible has lots of truths. Some of those truths are universal and apply to other religions and philosophies as well. So this transcendentalist movement came about almost as this sort of free form thinking outside the box, thinking as an individual. But it also came about too because for the first time in America, as we see with Note B, we're starting to see the influence of Eastern Asian texts coming in. So for the first time, of course, whenever we talk about Britain, Britain was colonizing like India at this time. So a lot of texts from India, like such as the Hindu and even Buddhist texts, were just starting to be translated over in English. So for the first time, a lot of the non-Western tradition is finally emerging here. Of course, non-Western religions have a slightly more different view of spirituality. Right? Oftentimes they believe that, a sort of polytheistic universe, meaning there's more than one God. But often at the same time, especially in Hinduism, there's a belief that we're all of us as different souls, all of us are part of God in different ways. We're each a piece of the larger whole that is God. So a lot of these sorts of ideas from Eastern Asian texts are kind of blending together with Christianity to create this philosophy of transcendentalism. So basically what Emerson did, he came up with this philosophy. He was a widower. His wife left him a fairly large inheritance. So Emerson pretty much just took the opportunity. Hey, he didn't have to work. He would just go around and be guest lecturers at different places. Of course, in the 19th century, they didn't have Netflix. So what did you do for entertainment in the evenings? Oftentimes lots of intellectual type people would go around and give lectures, on whatever topic it was of the day, whether it's self-reliance or the issue of slavery or women's rights or temperance or whatever, right? Oftentimes there was these sort of public readings and gatherings about these issues. So Emerson sort of made a life about doing that, and in turn he got a wide variety of followers. But to find, besides who influenced the Transcendentalist movement, you got to know that it's in large part a reaction to the Enlightenment. When we talked about the Enlightenment, we talked about Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, but all those guys had philosophical sort of influences in John Locke. John Locke, of course, was the philosopher who came up with the idea that we're all blank slates when we're born. Right? We learn language, we learn everything we do, all of our human behavior can be described by what we pick up from other people and from our parents. John Locke believed that it's not necessarily our inner nature that makes us who we are, it's how we're nurtured to be who we are. And, well, the Transcendentalists, they thought that that's almost too, I don't know what the great word is, scientific view of how people tick. They believed a lot more in a human being's inner nature, right? Whenever we talk about nature in an Emerson sense, it's with a capital N, right? It's not just talking about the woods, it's talking about our inner selves. We all have a great sense of inner self. And we also, so that is something to think about. But it's also about this idea that we can't, in order to be ourselves, we can't be confined to what other people think, right? We have strong people, strong self-reliance is the word here. Strong self-reliant people have to break free of tradition. They have to pave their own path through life. They can't worry about what other people think. So, as I say in part C, the importance of individuality in an age of conformity. Right? You can't conform to what other people want you to do. You have to be your own self. You have to find yourself in order to find happiness. And one way that these essays suggest that is we can always go back into nature to sort of find that we're part of this larger universe, right? To find our soul, to find that we all are part of God in some way. So, like I said here, many of these ideas that Emerson is giving us are theoretical. Others, people who were going to read in the course, took his ideas to heart, and ran with them. So, for instance, we're going to read Henry David Thoreau's Walden. Thoreau actually lived on Emerson's property. He wrote this great book about how he retreated back into nature. Nature sort of gave him this rebirth to find himself. He didn't hold a job. He just kind of went completely off the grid. But he talks about how he lives peacefully without being part of society. Finding himself within this beautiful place, Walden Pond, near Boston. We had the poet Walt Whitman, who were kind of reading around the same time as Emerson. Just a bit about Whitman. Emerson's coming up with these ideas saying, hey, we need to be free individuals. We can't follow tradition. Well, Whitman said, yes, you're exactly right as far as poetry goes. Why are our American poets continuing to follow the same traditions that British poets followed? Why do we still have poems with rhyme? Why do we still have poems with meter? Right? Why are we writing sonnets? We need to come up with our own form of poetry. And Whitman kind of helped innovate that and what we now think of as free verse. Right? Free verse is poetry that doesn't have to be rhymed. Right? It's sure it has rhythm to it, but it doesn't have to rhyme. It's unrhymed iambic pentameter. So the lines can go as long as they want. They can be as short as they want, as long as it follows whatever sort of beat and sound and message you want to hear. Of course, Whitman's poems also sort of took Emerson's ideas of the individual and individuality, finding yourself in this larger world. So think about Emerson, especially as you read through Whitman. But we also have other figures like Frederick Douglass. Right? Frederick Douglass's slave narrative is arguably the greatest transcendental story about finding your own self within a slave society. Right? A slave society wants to crush your individuality. They want to bend you to their will so that you will be a slave. Of course, Margaret Fuller is another thinker who wrote a lot of transcendentalist texts about women's rights. Lots of most of the poets, even novelists, like Nathaniel Hawthorne had a relationship with Emerson. A lot of the literary production that took place in America was about this sort of transcendental movement. They became this sort of circle of friends and thinkers who would gather and share ideas and things like that. They had a very prominent influence on American culture, especially Northern American culture. Okay, the South might have been a little different. So just to illustrate, I've typed some passages out that I will read for you to illustrate Emerson's ideas. But this first one comes from Nature, chapter 1. If you've read through Nature on your own time, you'll know it can sometimes be a little hard to keep up with. Oftentimes a good way to read Emerson is to also listen to it at the same time. You can kind of hear Emerson well, to keep up with it, because Emerson kind of jumps around a lot. So if you listen, you can kind of keep up a little better, I think. But this is a great passage that explains finding yourself within nature. He says, nature is a setting that fits equally well a comic or a morning piece. In good health, the air is a cordial of incredible virtue. Crossing a bare common in snow puddles at twilight under a clouded sky without having in my thoughts any occurrence of special good fortune, I have enjoyed a perfect exhilaration. Almost I fear to think how glad I am. In the woods, too, a man casts off his years as the snake his slough, and at what period soever of life is always a child. In the woods is perpetual youth. Within these plantations of God, a decorum and sanctity reign. A perennial festival is dressed, and the guest sees not how he should tire of them in 1,000 years. In the woods, we return to reason and faith. There I feel that nothing can befall me in life, no disgrace, no calamity, leaving me my eyes, which nature cannot repair. Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing, I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or particle of God. So this passage, fix my spelling, this passage illuminates what I just said about, we are all part of this greater being, right? We're all part of God in some way. This idea that comes very much so from Eastern religion. And then when we think about Christianity, right, there is God in Christ, but we're our own souls. Emerson's idea here is when we go into nature, we become part of more of this universal soul, right? We come to peace because we're at home. Going into the woods gives him the opportunity to cast off all the stress and burden of civilization, of daily life, living with other people. This sort of imaginary fiction that we've created for ourselves. And it allows us to come to peace with ourselves. So this idea of him becoming a transparent eyeball, right? He sees the world, he sees God almost for what it is. So that's one of the key passages in nature, talking about how nature can help. He says nature can help us come to terms with ourselves, right? Nature is almost what we want it to be. It can be a great thing, it can be peaceful, but it can also be something that echoes our bad moods too, right? Nature is what we want it to be, but it is a conduit for allowing ourselves to find ourselves more. As far as so that's from nature. As far as self-reliance goes, the essay of self-reliance is something that you're going to see more of this show up in Thoreau and Walden, Thoreau's Walden and Frederick Douglass and everything like that, more than anything else from Emerson. So just some passages here. Whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist. He who would gather immortal palms must not be hindered by the name of goodness, but must explore it if it is goodness. Nothing is at least sacred but the integrity of your own mind. Absolve you to yourself, and you shall have the suffrage of the world. So that line, nothing is at least sacred but the integrity of your own mind. It is easy in the world to live after the world's opinion. It is easy in solitude to live after our own. But the great man is he who in the midst of the crowd keeps with perfect sweetness the independence of solitude. So within a crowd, you should not follow the crowd's leanings, right? You should be your own person. You should be a free thinker. And the last passage I've typed for you, foolish consistency, this line's great. A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds adored by little statesmen and philosophers and divines. With consistency, a great soul has simply nothing to do. He may as well concern himself with this shadow on the wall. Ah, then, exclaimed the aged ladies, you shall be sure to be misunderstood. Misunderstood is a right fool's word. Is it so bad then to be misunderstood? Pythagoras was misunderstood, and Socrates, and Jesus, and Luther, and Copernicus, and Galileo, and Newton, and every pure and wise spirit that ever took flesh. To be great is to be misunderstood. So here we see this idea, right? You're not going to be a person who's going to be remembered for following the crowd, right? You're not going to be remembered, for conforming to what other people want you to do. You're going to be remembered by being your own person, your own soul, and following your convictions in your heart. So this idea of self-reliance. Of course, the idea, as I mentioned with Emerson, did Emerson really go practice what he preached? Well, maybe not. But a lot of these other people who we're going to read did practice these ideas that he's preaching. So that's a little bit about that. Hope that gives you some good introduction. But especially as we continue over the next week, as you read Whitman's Song of Myself, right, the poem that innovated poetry, I wanted to break tradition. You know, of course, you'll see those ideas about the soul and things like that in that poem. As you read Walden, right, the great book about not conforming to society and living off the grid, as you read Frederick Douglass, right, think about all these ideas that we've been talking about here. You know, you will, these will, of course, will be some essay topics that I will be giving you. So until next time, guys, take care. Hope you enjoyed the video. See you later.